What is free will, and how does it relate to cause and effect? Are there different definitions for free will? Let's ask Augustine. Today we'll talk about Augustine's views on free will. This is from The City of God, Book 5, chapters 9 through 11. So here we're introducing the idea, the problem of free will. This is to say, if the universe is ordered by cause and effect, how can my choices be free? And how can I be responsible? So how does free will relate to cause and effect? And how does that relate to responsibility? We seem to say that someone is responsible for their choice if their choice was a free choice. But what is freedom in relation to cause and effect? Augustine answers this in response to Cicero. Augustine's motive is ultimately to defend the sovereign rule of God over the universe and validate moral responsibility. He wants to affirm both of these things because of his religious views in Christianity. Some previous thinkers also discussed responsibility and choice. So Plato or Socrates says that the good orders the universe logically, and therefore he ends up being a kind of intellectual determinism, which is to say that reason dictates action and the will follows necessarily. Aristotle said the universe is ordered mechanically by the four causes, but people have the ability to choose otherwise. Now, there's various interpretations of Aristotle. He's probably libertarian, but it really depends on interpretation. An important thing to think about when reading these old thinkers, especially the older you go, is that we have modern questions that they were not necessarily asking. Of course, as we read these different thinkers, we can apply them in new ways to new questions as our continuing conversation expands and grows and covers new areas. So that's not to say that these people have nothing to say on this issue, but it is to say that when they thought about free will, they were probably asking slightly different questions than we are now. For Aristotle, we'll define these terms libertarian and determinism here in a moment. So don't worry about that. We'll define those here in a bit. Augustine says that God determines all events in the universe, but people are responsible. This is called compatibilism, saying that determinism and free will are compatible. This is influenced some by Neoplatonism, especially as well his Christian theology. Again, we will define these terms as the video goes along. Let's talk about causation as sort of a preliminary investigation before we really get into Augustine and his arguments against Cicero. We all observe that the world is ordered by consistent laws that govern cause and effect, making natural science possible. Let's look at a seed, for example. We know that when we put a seed in the ground and we water it, give it some sunshine, eventually it grows into a plant. This is a pattern that we see in nature, and we can investigate these with science because these patterns are consistent. There's a consistent cause and effect that goes on here. You have a seed, and then you add certain other variables, and certain effects will always follow, unless some additional variable comes in. For example, somebody comes in and picks the plant. Perhaps it's a flower. They might pick the plant. That's an additional variable, but we know it. We can investigate it with cause and effect. Cause and effect also govern human action, also observed in the sciences. Let's say flipping a coin. What is the probability that it lands heads up? 50-50, of course. Does chance cause it to land head up? No. Probability is not a cause. Probability only describes a state of ignorance, having no answer. We do not know, before we flip the coin, we do not know if it's going to land heads up or tails up. After it is flipped and lands heads up, do we know what caused it to land that way? No, we do not. But what do we know? We know that there were causes. We know that something caused it to land heads up. But we don't know what variables caused it. The principle of sufficient reason, as described by Leibniz, says, we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise. Although most of the time these reasons cannot be known to us. We know, for example, that there is nothing internal to the coin or to the person that necessitates that it had to land heads up or tails up. It could land either way. And because it could land either way, we can expect that there is a reason, an explanation for why it did, in fact, land heads up. What might have caused it? All right, so Leibniz says most of the time we do not know all of the reasons, but we know that there are reasons, and we can guess at some of them, and that can lead to the beginning of an investigation. What might have caused this coin to land heads up? Well, how much force my thumb applied to the coin and how high up the coin traveled, right? The force of my thumb. Perhaps wind currents, certainly the friction in the air and the interaction between the coin and the air. Who knows how many variables may be playing? The temperature of the air may have affected it. Also, gravity. How far did the coin need to fall? And when it did fall, did it hit a table and roll a little bit? What about the structure and shape of the table? What about what the table is made of? All of these things are many of the possible factors that could have played into why the coin landed heads up. We know that there has to have been a cause, even if we don't know all of these causes. There's just too many variables to know. What causes a choice? Why did you choose something? Usually we expect there's an answer, even if we don't know all the reasons. Which snack does Bill choose? All right, we're just going to take an example here. Bill chooses the apple instead of the chocolate cake. Why? What variables was he thinking about as he chose? Well, he might have thought, the apple is healthier. He also thought, I don't actually like frosting. He also thought the apple is cheaper. He also thought, I want to set an example for my kids. Also, he generally just has a habit of making healthy choices, so that even in this moment, if he did not think of all of these things, he's thought of them in the past, and he has a certain pattern of behavior where he acted on habit. Maybe he didn't think about it this time, but he's thought about it in the past, and so he has a habit of acting in a certain way. Also, there may be other non-conscious variables that he's not even aware of. He may not be aware of all of the reasons why he chose one thing rather than the other. There may be aspects of our own personality we do not yet understand. Why do we prefer one thing rather than another? Or other variables that are outside of the person. You see, as we look at all of these different variables, a lot of them are not even up to his choice. Bill did not choose to make apples healthier. They already are. Even before he ever was born, apples already are more healthy than the chocolate cake. All right? Or let's say frosting. Why does he not like frosting? A lot of times, these preferences of ours are dependent upon prior choices. Sometimes not. For example, there are certain items of food that I want to like, and I keep trying to like them and trying to eat them, but to some degree, it doesn't seem to be totally up to my choice. What about his habit of making healthy choices? He doesn't determine what is and is not healthy. He follows guidelines, investigating his own body and his own needs, and learns about these factors from other things. Also, who set the price? Well, the grocery store set the price. So there's so many different factors, all these different factors that he had no control over. And as he considers these factors, they play into whether or not he is going to choose the apple or the cake. So he did not choose the price of the apple, but perhaps being very budget conscious because of other factors. Maybe he just got fired from his job. There's all these other factors that play into a choice, all of these external things. Well, how do they relate to the choice? Do we have free will, or is everything caused? Just like the seed growing into a plant, or just like the coin landing heads up? Is that the same for a choice? Simply, there's so many variables that choice is an illusion, or maybe it's not illusion. How does choice relate to cause? Or is this a false dichotomy, saying that you either have free will or everything is caused? Maybe there's a third option. Let's look at Cicero's argument. Now let's jump in. On the left, we're going to have some symbolic logic to represent a summary of Cicero's argument. Cicero says that if God has foreknowledge, then everything is caused. This is to say determinism. If everything is caused, determinism. All right? So if God has foreknowledge, then he causes everything. He defines free will as saying that my choice is contra causal, which is to say that despite influences from outside, ultimately I am the cause of my choice. And also, I have to have the ability to choose otherwise. Even if I have freedom, but I don't have the ability to choose otherwise because of my situation, then it's not free will. So free will requires both of these things, the ability to choose otherwise and being contra causal. We'll investigate what these two mean in a little bit more detail here in a moment. Next, Cicero says either we have free will or everything is caused, but not both. All right? He poses a dichotomy. Then he says an implication of the second premise up there, which is line number 2, definition of free will, is that if everything is caused, free will does not exist. Then he says if God has foreknowledge, then free will does not exist. This is to say a syllogism, okay? This is to say that if God has foreknowledge, then everything is caused. And if everything is caused, then there is no freedom. Therefore, you take out the middle factor here, you take out the middle item, the middle term, and we just have if God has foreknowledge, then there's no freedom. This is Cicero's argument. All right? But he says, in fact, we know that free will exists. Therefore, this is a modus tollens argument in logic. This is to say, if we know that free will does exist, then it has to be the case that God does not have foreknowledge. Therefore, God does not have foreknowledge. So, in summary, if God has foreknowledge, and thus causes everything, then we don't have free will. Since we do have free will, then God must not have foreknowledge. His motive, Cicero's motive, is to verify that we do in fact have moral responsibility, and that this is based on freedom. His assumption is that if God has foreknowledge, he causes future choices in some way. Cicero and Augustine both agree. Even though they will define that causation a little bit differently, they generally agree on this. Another assumption is that moral responsibility requires freedom. Cicero and Augustine also agree on this. Another assumption is that freedom is defined as being contra causal and the ability to do otherwise. Cicero and Augustine disagree on this, and this is the point that we will investigate in more detail. How should we actually define freedom? Here's Cicero's argument once again, but let's look at Augustine's argument. Augustine's argument is that Cicero poses a false dichotomy. Augustine rejects Cicero's definition of free will. This assumption is not true, according to Augustine. Therefore, he says, the argument is actually valid, but as we've learned in our critical thinking videos, a principle of logic is that an argument may be valid and logical, but if it starts from a false assumption, it is not sound. And sound is what we want. We want a sound argument. Let's define freedom a little bit more carefully. There are three contested elements to the definition of freedom. First is contra causal. This is to say that I am the primary cause of my choice, such that any external causes or influences do not determine my action. Outside influences, I can choose to ignore them or follow them. Ultimately, the choice is caused by me and is contrary to external causation external to my will. Another element is the principle of alternate possibilities. This is to say, the ability to do otherwise. So if I'm in a situation where I really only have one choice and I have no alternate possibilities, then it's not really a choice. I'm forced to pick this one thing. That's the principle of alternate possibilities, or PAP. Another element is the greatest desire, which is to say, I choose based on desire. What is it that I most desire? In any given situation, the thing that I choose is whatever I desire the most, my greatest desire. I choose according to my greatest desire. So of course there are times when we have to do what we do not want to do, but that is not to say that we do not follow our greatest desire. It just means that we sacrifice a lesser desire for a higher desire. For example, you may not want to be watching this video right now. You may not want to be doing homework. You would rather do something more enjoyable, but that is as they are considered in themselves, right? At the end of the day, you chose to watch this video, and one reason may be because you actually, you certainly desire to enjoy yourself in the moment, but a greater desire is that you have a long-term goal of accomplishing your education and getting a job with your education. And you desire that more than the momentary enjoyment that you're sacrificing right now. So you're following your greatest desire. That's what greatest desire means. Now we have two general competing camps for the definition of evil. First, we have libertarians. Of course, there's many flavors of libertarianism, but I'm just going to speak in generalities. In general, libertarians always assert some form of contra causality. However, not all libertarians are proponents of PAP. Most of them are proponents of both of these, and they all are proponents of contra causality, and some of them are proponents of PAP, probably most of them. And then we have compatibilists. All compatibilists are going to define freedom in terms of greatest desire, and many, but not all, compatibilists affirm the principle of alternate possibilities. So both camps affirm the principle of alternate possibilities. And the big question is about whether freedom is essentially defined as what is the essential definition of freedom? Okay, so libertarians are going to say essentially that freedom is the ability to choose contrary to influences or external causes. But compatibilists are going to say that freedom is the ability to choose what you want. So how do we normally talk about freedom? Do we say, yes, I'm free to finally do what I want? Or do we say, yes, I'm free to do anything I want completely despite any other influences or factors? Right? Which is most logical when we get down to the details of it? Compatibilism says that free will and determinism are compatible. That's where we get the word compatible. This is not the same as saying that people are robots or animals. Choice is from self-conscious desire. Robots do not have that desire, and animals are not self-conscious of that desire. This highlights an important difference between fatalism and determinism. Fatalism says that freedom is not real. Fatalism says that free will is an illusion. Fatalism says that no matter what you do, you cannot resist what is going to happen. Fate is something that you may not like, and you may want to do otherwise. You may want to resist fate, but you can't. You're sort of forced into your choices, even though you didn't want. But determinism is different. Determinism says causation is intentional and works through our will, not despite it. So that's to say, in determinism, with determinism, when you desire to do something, that is part of the causal chain of that choice and of acting in that way. So you cannot be angry with determinism, saying that determinism forced me to choose something I did not want, because in fact, whatever you want is going to be your choice, and determinism will always line up with your desires, because your desires are part of determinism. So it works through our will and not against it or despite it. Now let's talk more about the principle of alternate possibilities and why some people affirm this and why others do not. The principle of alternate possibilities is when a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. So a man named Harry Frankfurt challenges PAP in 1969, and here is one of his challenges, a sort of story or illustration that challenges this proposition. Black wants to shoot Smith and learns that Jones wants to as well, and resolves to let Jones kill Smith on his own. If Jones changes his mind, Black has a plan B and will manipulate Jones into shooting Smith anyway. Jones cannot do otherwise, but he is still responsible when he chooses to shoot Smith on his own. Jones cannot do otherwise, but we still say that he acted freely and that he is responsible. Many libertarians and compatibilists have abandoned PAP because of Harry Frankfurt's criticism of it. A famous libertarian who has abandoned PAP because of this argument is Eleanor Stump. And of course, a famous compatibilist who abandoned PAP is Harry Frankfurt himself. Now let's do the write-up. Augustine on free will. At this point, do you believe in libertarianism, compatibilism, or fatalism? That there is no free will. Why do you believe that?